One spring day in 1989, you, as the trade director of PepsiCo's Soviet subsidiary, received instructions from headquarters in the United States to travel to a Baltic port to finalize a new barter trade order with the Soviet government. You had done this countless times before. Ever since Pepsi first entered the Soviet Union over a decade ago, the Soviets had been enamored with this American carbonated beverage. But for some reason, the Soviet government had been constantly exchanging various goods, such as vodka, for Pepsi. You assumed this would be just another ordinary exchange, until you arrived at the port and saw the object of the exchange: an entire Soviet naval fleet. Why would the Soviet Union, a former superpower and America's biggest rival during the Cold War, choose to use warships to pay for its Pepsi bill? The story begins in a kitchen. In 1959, at the American National Exhibition in Moscow, US Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev engaged in a famous debate in a model kitchen. The essence of the debate was a comparison of the superiority of socialism versus capitalism. Dishwashers, refrigerators, and ovens were used by Nixon to demonstrate how capitalism improved the lives of ordinary people. During the heated debate, Donald Kendall, Vice President of International Business at PepsiCo, did something. He handed Khrushchev a drink. It was a Pepsi made with local Moscow water. Khrushchev praised it after drinking it, commenting, "Very refreshing." He not only drank it himself, but also enthusiastically shared it with the Soviet officials around him. This scene was captured perfectly by a photographer, and the next day, American newspapers featured photos of Khrushchev holding a Pepsi, humorously using Pepsi's advertising slogan at the time, "Khrushchev also wants to be sociable." This public relations effort proved highly successful. It laid a solid foundation for Pepsi's entry into the Soviet Union, making it the first American brand to do so. This also answered a question. Despite Coca-Cola being more popular than Pepsi at the time, Pepsi became the only brand to capture the hearts and palates of the Soviet people. At that moment, it seemed like a market victory. But the real trouble was yet to come. Pepsi successfully entered the Soviet market. Soviets quickly fell in love with Pepsi. The problem was, they paid for it in rubles. In the international financial system, the ruble is a non-convertible currency. This was an institutional design. Under the planned economy framework, the Soviet Union maintained strict foreign exchange controls for a long time. The ruble could not be freely exchanged for the US dollar, the British pound, or any hard currency. The exchange rate was not market-determined, but administratively set. The reason is not complicated. The distribution of goods in the Soviet Union was controlled by a centrally planned quota system, not by the currency itself. The ruble did not possess true monetary attributes. It was more like an accounting tool. Because commodity prices were set by the government, the ruble's value could not reflect the true market situation. Once free convertibility was allowed, the ruble's true purchasing power would be quickly exposed in the international market, triggering a sharp devaluation of the ruble and domestic inflation. Therefore, the Soviet Union chose internal credit circulation. Could PepsiCo spend all the rubles it earned in the Soviet Union? The answer was no. Similarly, due to the Soviet Union's strict commodity control and allocation, foreign companies like PepsiCo could not purchase large quantities of raw materials or assets locally. For PepsiCo, its purpose in selling cola in the Soviet Union was to bring profits back to the United States and distribute them to its global shareholders, not to leave all profits in the Soviet Union. The money Pepsi earned in the Soviet Union could not be remitted back to the United States, could not be used for international settlements, and could not be used to purchase any hard currency. It could only remain within the Soviet Union, like an ever-growing digital island. This is a typical characteristic of planned economies during the Cold War. Currency exists, but credit is only valid within national borders. PepsiCo had to find a way to convert its sold cola into US dollars that it could bring home. So, they chose the oldest solution: barter. PepsiCo was not the only company the Soviet Union chose to barter. In fact, even at the height of the Cold War confrontation, the Soviet Union maintained trade relations with Western countries. The Soviet Union exchanged resources such as oil, natural gas, and gold for hard currencies such as US dollars. However, these foreign exchange reserves were extremely limited and were typically prioritized for paying foreign debt interest and purchasing core strategic materials such as advanced industrial equipment or large quantities of grain urgently needed due to poor harvests. When faced with foreign consumer products like Pepsi, the Soviet Union was often reluctant to use its precious foreign exchange reserves for payment, making barter the only option. Fortunately, the Soviet Union had one thing that had both an international market and could be exchanged for US dollars: vodka. Through a series of complex but legal agreements, Pepsi exchanged its Pepsi concentrate for the global distribution rights to the Soviet Union's top brand, Stolichnaya vodka. Soviets drank Pepsi, Americans drank vodka. Pepsi acted as the middleman in settling accounts. This wasn't a romantic, cross-cultural exchange. It was the financial system's self-rescue from a liquidity trap. But any barter trade has a fatal weakness. It depends on political stability. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. This was followed by a comprehensive boycott of Soviet goods by the United States. Vodka was the first to be affected. Due to the boycott by American consumers, Pepsi's payment channels were cut off. Meanwhile, the situation within the Soviet Union deteriorated rapidly. The Afghan war had consumed too much of the Soviet Union's funds and resources. Foreign exchange reserves were depleted and hard currency was scarce. However, the consumption habits that Soviets had already established were irreversible. Soviets couldn't give up Pepsi. By the late 1980s, Pepsi's sales in the Soviet Union had peaked at 1 billion bottles a year. Continuing to supply would mean accumulating unconvertible rubles. Stopping supply would trigger social unrest. Therefore, the Soviet Union offered a seemingly crazy, yet logically clear solution. If we don't have dollars and we don't have vodka, then we'll settle accounts with the only thing we have left that we can sell to foreigners: warships. In 1989, an agreement was reached. The Soviet Union would exchange 17 decommissioned submarines, 1 cruiser, 1 destroyer, 1 frigate, for the supply of Pepsi concentrate in the Soviet Union. This was not a military transaction, it was a trade made out of necessity. You might wonder, of all the resources and materials the Soviet Union possessed, why was it only military equipment that could be traded? If you've seen the movie Lord of War, you'll definitely remember the arms dealer played by Nicolas Cage. The various weapons and equipment he sold came from the Soviet Union after the collapse of the Eastern Bloc. Tanks, helicopters, and guns priced by the ton. These movie scenes are actually based on reality. In fact, PepsiCo never possessed an active navy. All these ships were either decommissioned or nearing decommissioning and had no combat capability. They were valued at scrap metal value. Pepsi had no intention of keeping them, much less operating them. All the ships were resold and dismantled for scrap metal, sold to Scandinavian companies in exchange for real hard currency. But this reveals a more brutal truth. The Soviet Union preferred to sell steel, technology, and military assets rather than pay in dollars, not because of strategy, but because they genuinely lacked dollars. Besides the inability of the Soviet ruble to be converted into dollars, more importantly, the Soviet Union had a long-standing lack of industrial goods that could attract Western consumers. Besides exporting resources like oil and natural gas, the Soviet Union was unable to generate foreign exchange through large-scale exports, leading to a chronic hard currency crisis. This was a continuously collapsing financial system. Domestic currency was still in circulation, the state apparatus was still functioning, but the credit connection with the world had been severed. When a country starts using warships to settle beverage bills, the problem is no longer about trade itself. In 1990, Pepsi signed an even larger agreement with the Soviet Union, worth $3 billion. In exchange for oil tankers and energy assets, it acquired the rights to supply Pepsi. But this time, history didn't allow for a completion of the deal. A year later, the Soviet Union collapsed. Overnight, Pepsi found itself no longer dealing with one country, but with 15 new ones. For a multinational corporation, this was the most dangerous moment. The assets still existed, but the order that maintained a stable business environment had vanished. Pepsi earned its place in history, but lost to history itself. This deal neither failed nor succeeded. It simply stopped at a rupture point in an era. Like a submarine that hadn't been completely dismantled, it lies quietly in the dock of history.